Welcome everybody to the Right to Erasure webinar. It's great to have the opportunity to talk to you this morning. As Cherie said, my name's Alan Bentley. I'm actually now the President of Global Sales at Blancco. I've been working in the information security business for well over 20 years and with Blancco for about a year and a half. So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to chat about the Right to Erasure specifically. And I'll hand over to Estelle for her to introduce herself to you.
Hello, my name is Aseli Ibrahimova. I'm an associate here at Squire Patent Box in the data protection and cybersecurity team based in London. We are advising a lot of clients today on the GDPR compliance and happy to talk over some issues on this webinar.
Excellent. I'm really happy to have you, Estelle. You know, the opportunity to have somebody that's working specifically with the legal requirement is a real bonus for us to be able to have Estelle on the call today, and certainly as we get towards the end where the Q&A section becomes live, I'm sure a lot of you might have some very specific questions that Estelle may be able to answer for you. Right, so let's get into it and get into the detail of the actual webinar itself. We're going to start off with a poll question for you guys and girls on the call, just to make sure you're all paying attention. And Cherie's chucked up the questions in your view, so you should be able to see the questions outlined there from A to E. What I'd like to hear back from you on the webinar itself here is how would you rate your organisation's level of preparation to adhere to EU GDPR? You know, are you unprepared? Are you on the right track? Are you somewhat prepared, fully prepared, or don't know? So if you guys would like to put your answers in on the right-hand side, we'll see what comes up in terms of where you think you are. We've got about 20-odd seconds before you won't be able to answer the questions. And it gives me a bit of an insight into the audience on the call here in terms of where you see your organisation as it is today from a GDPR requirements perspective. Cherie, it's finished, so the poll's ended. Not sure I got any feedback my end. Cherie, did you get any feedback your end?
Yes, Alan, just share those.
Okay, excellent.
There you go.
On the right track, no answer. 33% don't know. Okay, that's good. Well, thanks very much, everybody. So quite an interesting mix of answers there. On the right track is certainly a good response with regards to where we are in terms of timing. Obviously, we're running out of time pretty rapidly here, and having spoken to a number of organisations over the last 12 to 18 months, it's a bit of a race against time, as we all know. Coming up here in May 2018, where the regulation actually goes live. And quite interestingly, we did a fairly wide-ranging survey a couple of years ago where, pretty much the majority of people that we spoke to back then were, not fully prepared at all. And I wouldn't have expected even the 20% to be fully prepared at that point. Probably, in terms of answering the question, it was fully prepared to get prepared rather than fully prepared, as in I'm ready to go from a compliance framework point of view. But there was another report that was done fairly recently. This was more in line with some of the conversations I've been having with various organisations across EMEA and also, in other parts of the world as well. The meeting the actual deadline might be a problem because there's so much to the whole process around building a framework around compliance. Actually being ready, fully ready to meet the compliance deadline when we're only effectively 6 to 7 months away, it is a real challenge for a lot of companies. So that being said, another quick question to give me some feedback from where you think you are. It's quite an interesting one. Is how, given the wide scope of GDPR, and there's a bunch of you answered saying that you're on track. What would be interesting to me is to kind of understand how you're going to prioritize compliance, because trying to take the entire regulation in of itself, building a full framework and process around that is very complex. And any of you that are actually on the phone, actually in the day-to-day business of trying to deal with that with compliance officers within your organization, or if you're one yourself, knows fully well how complicated the entire process around building frameworks and auditing those frameworks, etc. is. So another quick panel question here, A to F, knowledge of available GDPR compliance solutions, existing connections, highest penalties, advice from external consultancy, or advice from internal subject matter expert. How are you guys trying to prepare yourself to meet that deadline? Given the feedback we're getting from a lot of organisations is that you might well be on the right track, but you might not be on the right track in time to be fully compliant in May. Is there a way that you are within your organisation trying to prioritise the compliance process? So we'll give you here about 30 odd seconds to answer those questions, although it just clicked over. For me, Cherie, I don't know what it's doing your end, but it stopped. The time counter stopped. Oh, so we've got some responses. We got don't know is how to prioritise. Okay, advice from external consultants and highest penalties, and that, yeah, I mean that's fairly non-surprising to me in terms of the responses that we've got there. If you've got no answer, it'd be really interesting if you could give us some feedback on the poll questions, because obviously it helps frame the conversation as we go forward. We can refocus some more on areas that are very interesting to you yourselves. But one of the things obviously that is important to understand in terms of your compliance priorities is that there are penalties associated with EU GDPR. Now, I certainly don't want to get into the whole, you've got to do GDPR because it's, you're going to get fined X, Y, Z. There's a lot more to it than that. I mean, ultimately, it's a regulation. But there are differences in the way that articles can be penalised. And so one of the areas that we have seen is that organisations will be interested in prioritising areas that could potentially cause them more punitive damages. So I'm going to pass over to Estelle now, because she's way more an expert in this field than I am, to kind of give you a little bit more of a background on the compliance priorities and what these articles really mean to you. So Estelle, would you like to take over from here on this particular topic?
Sure, Alan, thank you. It's only 6, 7, or 8 months left till May 2018, where the GDPR will become enforceable. So not really much time left, and a lot of organizations haven't even started their GDPR compliance project. And a lot of clients are coming to us and asking, where do we start, how do we prioritize? And I mean, and there is a lot to do. First of all, organizations need to understand what personal data they process. Is it actually personal data? How does the GDPR apply? Where that data sits? What legal basis or legal justification the companies have to process it. Companies need to redraft notices, which are now much more prescriptive under the GDPR. There is an obligation on the companies to actually draft data protection policies. You have to prepare to the mandatory data breach notification. Companies need to think about whether or not to appoint a DPO. Companies need to renegotiate contracts with all the third parties that process or in any way touch their personal data. So there is a lot to do. And the ICO and the GDPR, the main message around prioritization is that the steps that organizations need to take will depend on the risk So the higher risk in processing, if you are, for example, processing any sensitive personal data, if you're monitoring or profiling individuals, if there are any children's data involved, then that's where your high risks lie, and that's where your compliance steps should be focused on. And the GDPR is about taking measures based on risk. And obviously, obviously then, when the higher risk areas are determined, the company should think in terms of, okay, what articles apply, and they will prioritize, as Alan said, based on the tiers of fines applicable to them. So this is how we, in short, go into the organizations. We come in, we do a gap assessment and prioritize the risk. We say, okay, this category of personal data is not that high risk, so deal with it maybe after May, or once you've done with high risk areas, and then implement the compliance measures. Alan?
Yeah, excellent. I think that's, and certainly I think we're going to go on and speak a little bit more about Article 7 and Article 17. So if I just ask a bit of a poll question about consent, because Article 7 and Article 17 are very pertinent to the conversation around, obviously, right to erasure is the topic of the webinar, but the right to consent, the article around consent, is kind of a predeterminant of a right to erasure. The two are very, very strongly linked, in my opinion. So currently within your organisation, I mean, what is your process for consent and a process for withdrawing consent? Do you have a process for both? Do you have a process for providing consent, or only for withdrawing consent, which I would think that's probably unlikely, or neither? And then we'll talk a little bit more about the process around consent. I think for me, having done my own research into GDPR, the area of consent is a very interesting one, I think, which goes a lot further than the Data Protection Act that is currently in place. So I'll let Asel talk to that, obviously more than I. And so it's interesting. One person on the webinar's got a process around both, which is great. I mean, that is certainly a good starting point. And not surprisingly, a bunch of people have got a process around getting consent, but not necessarily withdrawing. And I think that we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, because that is an area that has expanded under Article 7. But let me move to that slide and have Asel talk to it, and then perhaps I'll ask some questions of Asel myself once we get through this. But this area, I think, Asel, is quite a change, I think, in terms of the way and the impact it has on businesses around that are governed under GDPR. Would you agree with that, or?
Definitely, Alan. That's right. At least the corporate clients that we are advising, especially those that are business to customers rather than business to business, for them it's a big operational change that is requiring a lot of cost and investment. And obviously, this is because the conditions for obtaining consent and for withdrawal have significantly changed. So what we're seeing today is that clients usually rely on implied consent, where there isn't any positive action required from the individual, and to withdraw consent, they may be required to use another route. If there are consents, collected, they may also be more of an opt-out or bundled, where you say when you are ticking this box, you're consenting to the terms and conditions, and also are agreeing to, the privacy policy or something like that. So that's a very common way of obtaining consent that we're seeing today. But the GDPR has changed that, and you can see that in Article 7 and Recital 32, which is really helpful. And it says that the GDPR will now raise the standards, and it will require a clear affirmative act from the individual to demonstrate their consent. The consent will have to be freely given, which means it shouldn't be conditional on anything else. It has to be specific, and when it's a specific, it has to be specific to a purpose. So if you have several purposes, consent to process my sensitive personal data, or consent to send me some marketing material, they shouldn't be bundled, they should be separated. Also, the consent now needs to be informed, which means it should be preceded by a notice specific to that type of processing. So that's consent and obtaining of consent.
Hi, Estelle. Sorry, yeah. So there's a quick question from Alan on that. Well, because I've looked at a lot of compliance regulations in my time. Apart from PCI, not many of them are very prescriptive. And when I looked at this article, it is very prescriptive in the way that organisations do, and you mentioned it there in terms of purpose, so that you could potentially have to be very explicit in gaining consent on different ways that you will deal with personal identifiable information. So it's not enough, is it, to just have unambiguous consent? You have to be very, very explicit and specific.
That's for sure, Alan. And we are reviewing a number of methods and trying to make sure that the messaging is very clear. And it's all done, obviously, to bring back control over the personal data to the individuals. And I think rightly so. And one of the exercises the businesses are going through is to make sure, maybe to consider whether consent is not the only maybe method to justify processing. There are obviously other methods which may be used, such as processing which is necessary for performance of contract. So, for example, if you are a loyalty program, you may want to collect points, and that may be justified as performance of contract. If you are doing direct marketing, then that potentially could be justified by legitimate interest of the business. And there is obviously, for employment data, for employee data, legal obligation as a possible justification when, for example, you are collecting data on tax and sending it to HMRC. So there are things that can be considered and maybe way out of just doing it through consent.
Thanks, so. And what about withdrawal? Because that's obviously, that's a new piece, isn't it? Within, there's been a requirement for sort of vague consent, but some consent. Obviously, the consent itself is a lot more specific within GDPR, but also the withdrawal, as in, it has to be as easy to withdraw it as it is to obtain it, which is completely new within GDPR, as is my understanding.
Well, that's right. So the individual should be able to withdraw consent as easy, in an easy way as it was given. So, and that's Article 7.3. And obviously, a lot of businesses have now to change that, because if they are obtaining consent you know, in the best case, by opting in, then it also should provide an option for the individual to opt out by, again, just clicking or ticking a box, rather than saying call our, you know, customer service center or send us an email. So it should be following the same method as the method of obtaining consent. And this is really, again, related to the right of erasure, Article 17, because once the individual requests that the consent is withdrawn, then the controller has an obligation to delete that data. So they're clearly correlated.
Absolutely, yourself. So I changed the slide because you started to talk about right to erasure, and I think it was a good time, good segue into, because I think, you know, for me the two are very interlinked, and actually, obviously, both of them are certainly on the more punitive side of where the ICO might come down when the regulations go live. And the piece around consent that you talked to is incredibly relevant. So, and I think one of the areas that it will change the way businesses do business. There's no question about that. Certainly, those that are very intertwined in gathering personal identifiable information as part of the way they do business today. And even those organisations that don't are still going to have to understand that if they are collecting it, there is a, you know, there is a requirement for the explicit unambiguous consent and also the withdrawal. And then it does lead into a completely separate article, but the one is incredibly linked to the other, which is that if I have exercised my right to withdraw consent, I also then have a right to erasure, or for a lot of the people on the call, you may have been more, you know, it's commonly known also as right to be forgotten. Now, you know, there's always been a certain, so as far as I understand it, there's always been a kind of legal requirement to be able to dispose effectively and responsibly, sorry, I get the words out of my mouth, where it comes to, you know, data retention, etc., under existing law. But this is really expanding that, and obviously there, I think we could potentially have an hour, half an hour, hour's conversation specifically around the caveats around the right to be forgotten, because it generates a lot of conversation. You know, what about when there's a legal requirement from the government per se for you to retain data, even if somebody asks or has a legal says a legal claim that they want to withdraw it. So not always, if somebody exercises their right to withdraw consent, do they then automatically have a legal requirement for you to be, you know, for them to have their data erased. But there is a very specific point in the article that says, you know, that in essence, there is a requirement for you to have a process, and that is the you know, therein of itself lies the challenge. You need to have a process that, should you have a point in time where a citizen or a group of people have said, okay, now under these certain circumstances, I want to have the right to erase. I have the right to erase, and I can legally enforce that. You know, they can also get claims against you, not just under the breach from GDPR, but they can claim themselves as well. So this is a really interesting point in terms of trying to drive a process within your own organisation around the right to erasure. And Estelle, this also goes out to the internet as well, doesn't it? It becomes more on data that's residing in public. So the other big conversation is, how on earth do we go and find that data? Is another question. But
if I may add there, Alan, from the legal perspective, there is obviously there are principles of for data processing in Article 5 of the GDPR, and one of them is data storage limitation, and the non-compliance with the principles of the GDPR attracts a higher tier of fines. And the principle of storage limitation is really repeating the existing principle under the DPA, which is do not, store or hold personal data for longer than is necessary. And that is repeated, obviously, in Article 17, where it says the controller has the obligation to erase personal data if it's no longer necessary in relation to the purposes for which they were collected or otherwise processed. So it's reiterated, and a further stress is put on that obligation. And in terms of the evidence or proof of erasure, I mean, the GDPR, one of its, Article 5 again says you have to not only comply with the GDPR, but also to demonstrate your compliance. So I guess, the proof or certificate of erasure, which you mentioned in the previous slide, that's where it becomes relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a dual use, isn't it, Asel? That if you've got a certification of erasure, it proves that you erased the data, but it also proves that you were complying to the regulation. So it's a dual use. Yeah. Right, so let's get on to it. So just mindful we're up to 26 minutes, so we need to be a little bit mindful of time here. It's my fault, really, yourself, asking you questions. But so I'm sure if you've been on information security seminars, you would have seen this statement by Robert Mueller, the FBI director, in 2012. Put it in here because I actually think it's more relevant today than it's ever been. I've been in information security, as I said, at the top of the webinar for many, many years. And this is kind of undisputable, the fact that however much money we spend on information security, there is a point in time if somebody really wants to breach you, they will. Looking at some stats from the ICO in terms of the number of companies that are notifying of breach, that's only going to get even bigger. And I think, so this was an area I wanted you to talk to, Asel, more than me, was this 72-hour breach notification. Because, again, I talked about the consent being really, really a big thing within GDPR. I think the 72-hour breach notification is a huge thing as well. I mean, there are organizations that have legal requirements to notify about breach, but now everybody's going to have to, if you've got personal identifiable information, you're going to have to notify. And that's a big ask, isn't it, Asel? But it's it has to be done. Yeah, and there's how you notify as well. I think we talked before about how you notify, and I thought that was a very interesting perspective that you had on that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this obligation at the moment, applies already to telcos. It applies to healthcare organizations, but now it's an obligation that will apply from May 2018 to all organizations that process personal data, and every organization does. If you're employing anyone, obviously you will process personal data. So the obligation is such that, and it's Article 34 for anyone who would like to use this reference in the future. The obligation is to notify the personal data breach to the regulator if it's likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons within the 72 hours of detection. So maybe I'll give a practical example that maybe everyone can understand. If, for example, a business card was lost in the office, you have to assess whether or not this is a high risk to the individual and whether it needs to be reported to the ICO. I would probably think not, but there is another obligation to, if the data breach is of high risk and actually of such risk to the, is of such risk, that may cause high risk to the individual. Oh, sorry, I think I got mixed up. So if there is any risk to the individual, you report to the Data Protection Authority. If there is high risk to the individual, you notify the individual itself. So to put this, to make it more clear, imagine there was an email sent to HR from an employee who said, I have dyslexia, and that email was accidentally sent to the wrong recipient. And so in this case, you know this is a data breach. It means you need to notify the Data Protection Authority. If, for example, the email was protected by password, or the document which had medical details was password protected or encrypted, and the recipient was not able to read the email, then probably no need to notify, because you protected the information in a way that it wasn't disclosable. But if you didn't, then your obligation, then obviously you will have to notify. And obviously in this case, because this is sensitive personal data, because it's health data, mental, condition, mental health condition, so then it is also will be high risk to the rights of the individual, may affect their employment, etc. So this will also mean you have to notify the data subject as well.
Thanks, Asel. And I think the other thing that's kind of interesting there is that the way you notify the ICO or the individual will probably give them a fair indication of how well prepared you are for GDPR, because the way you notify the breach will probably give them a great indication of where you sit from a compliance point of view. So maybe the way you send a notification rule will bring down more pain, or it will actually push away the problem. So I think that's probably for another day. That's another longer conversation. But the fact of the matter is that no question that we're all under massive pressure from attacks and breaches. They're getting worse and more sustained. And so when it comes to being compliant, we need to make sure that we've got a very clear process in place, and a notification process will go a long way to helping people understand that you are in a reasonable shape from a compliance point of view. So very mindful that we're running on time here. Just a couple more slides to get through. So given that, obviously we're talking about effectively data breaches and personal identifiable information within that data, one of the massive challenges for all organisations is the never-ending increase in the storage of data, and it's being replicated across the size of your network constantly, and that within itself gets all organisations massive headaches, massive challenges. The less data we store, the more visibility we have into the data we are storing, and also the storage devices that we're now storing on have changed quite a lot over the last 10 years. Obviously from HDs to SSDs, logical levels, etc. But one of the interesting points around data, which is a real, again, an area where you can have a lot of debate, but most people actually don't know what percentage of data they store is of any use to the business. And Gartner says somewhere in the region of about 50 to 60% of all data on corporate networks is either no relevant or has no reason to, is not relevant, obsolete, or has no reason to be there. Which means for every one piece of one bit of information you're storing, one bit of information is there that doesn't need to be there, which is, that when you've got that size of a problem, and you're now trying to understand what would happen if you had a breach, where that personal identifiable information went, the size of the problem is getting bigger and bigger and bigger every day. So that's something we certainly need to consider. And the Cloud Security Alliance, obviously a lot of people moving data off-premise as well. And the Cloud Security Alliance are an organisation that put together a pretty interesting information management lifecycle. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this because you can get a copy, you'll have a recording. But the thing I think is very interesting is around creation. So when you create data, you should absolutely classify it, because if you classify it, you understand where and what it is, and then if you assign rights to it, you know who can access it. Storage around encryption, etc. I'm sure all of you guys understand all of that from a security point of view. But going all the way around the cycle there, you get to a point at the end where crypto shredding, secure deletion around destruction of the information, once it gets to a point where it's no longer needed, it's either obsolete or there's no need to retain the data. And please note that secure deletion is the optimum word there, not deletion. And secure deletion really means that you have proof that it's been deleted. Now, obviously, we would say erase, because deletion isn't the same as erase. Deletion, the data can still reside on your network, whereas erasure, it doesn't. So getting down to the last slide, right up onto 35 minutes here. I'm pretty sure most of you have been, you understand the information security onion. That a layered approach is the way that most organisations approach security today. Absolutely a requirement to have, firewalls, application layer firewalls, web filters, DDoS, all of the kind of processes that most organisations have in play today. A lot of those are still very reactive, even though they might sort of talk to being proactive. Something happens, it triggers an event, triggers a reaction, of then something occurs based on that potential attack. But ultimately, at the bottom line is that we talked right at the top of the webinar and around consent and right to erasure and data breaches, is that if the data does not need to exist in your environment, why keep it? And so the challenge is to try and minimize the amount of data that you store on your network, because that will minimize a lot of the headaches around the breach notification and the processes around that you went in to actually certify the erasure. So, that's the bottom line. Data can't be attacked or breached if it doesn't exist. Absolute categorical statement. So that's it from our side. We will open up to Q&A now, Cherie, I believe.
Yep, that's right. Thank you very much, Alan and Isel. So as a reminder, we just have 10 minutes to take questions. You can send your questions through using the chat function or the Q&A function on WebEx. So one of the questions that we have is, just going back to the beginning of this webinar, when we talked about identifying high-risk data, who in the organization should be leading that gap analysis?
What do you think yourself, from your working with organizations? Who's the main touch point within the company that should be working on identifying risk?
So normally we advise that a data governance team or group is established, and that should, before even starting the GDPR compliance project, hopefully you already got someone sponsoring or supporting this whole endeavor from the board level. So once you've got that kind of approval and you have resources and time to dedicate to the GDPR compliance, then you should create this data governance team, which usually consists of HR, IT. If you are a business to customer organization, then it should include marketing and of course legal. And they together will need to be identifying, where the data, what personal data you process, where it sits, what kind of technical and organizational measures you have to protect it based on risk. And it will be a joint exercise. And I would think once you have identified it, it's probably, you know, most organizations like to validate it by, you know, an external counsel as well, as it's at the moment quite a gray area.
So I saw there was a question from Simon with regards to indexing. Yeah, Simon, you know, absolutely, you know, targeting, being able to target data is a real, you know, that's the starting point. You know, you can't erase the data if you haven't targeted it. I would get in touch with Softcat. They've probably got a good solution for you in terms of indexing. And I think Cherie will probably take that offline and take that away for you. There's a question there, Cherie, which I think perhaps somebody within your organisation could help out with.
Definitely.
And then I saw another question, but I can't see the questions anymore. It's something to do with production and archiving.
Yep.
So if somebody has withdraws consent and requires you to erase, is it just in production, or is it all the data back to data that's been archived? And I believe it is. Estelle, what would you say?
Yes, it would normally include all of the data wipeout, but from a legal perspective. But the ICO being a bit more business-friendly organization, it has been, you know, providing guidance that if you move the personal data to the archiving or backup kind of system or network, and you show that it's no longer live data, you don't process it, only, for example, one or two individuals from the whole organization have access to it, and only for, you know, from the technical perspective, it may be the case that you won't be able to, you will be released from going into that system to respond to access rights of individuals. So if someone says, I want to know all of the data you hold, in that case, you don't have to actually go into your archive or backup systems. However, you will still be exposed to risk, because all other obligations under the GDPR will apply, such as keeping it secure, you know, etc. So I guess it's probably best from the risk exposure perspective that you delete it altogether.
Cool. Thank you.
Any more questions? I can't see the questions, Cherie, so you'll have to read them out to me.
Yeah, we have another question. So someone's asked, we're a processor of data on behalf of clients. Who is responsible for deletion/erasure of data in this case?
So I guess it's a question to me, I'm guessing, but I mean, Ellen, chip in if you have anything in addition. But from the legal perspective, under the GDPR, now both the controller and the processor have direct obligations, which means the data protection principles apply to both. So you obviously are processing personal data on behalf of your client, but it still resides in your system. Once your contract with the data controller has, you know, expired, you will be under an obligation to make sure it's erased in compliance with your data retention storage limitation policies.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Certainly, to Estelle's point, you know, one of the changes around GDPR is the processor and controller are now equally obligated. It would be a matter for the contract that you need to be very specific with the controller or the client that you're processing data for. Where does your obligation lie within GDPR? I think it's a conversation a lot of organisations are now having in terms of, you know, at what point is the obligation. You can't pass the obligation to Estelle's point. The data is residing in your environment, so you do still need to have a process around the way that you would go and erase that data should the data need to be erased. But certainly it's a, you know, we're seeing a lot more. I don't know, is it Mike that asked that question? I say, Mike, I'm seeing a lot more A lot more questions around the contractual obligation between controller and processor. It was, ultimately the data belonged to the controller previously, but that's the obligation to a sales point is equally shared between controller and processor now. My view on it is that you still have to have the processes in place, and then have some kind of contractual obligation between the two companies as to at what point do they pass over the request for the withdrawal of consent or the requirement for erasure.
Great, thank you. So we have one more question we will take. The question is it acceptable to use a secure online consent center to deal with requests for the right to be forgotten? Could this be as simple as a secured form which a data subject completes to make their request?
A secure online form? Well, I believe it would be okay in terms of gathering the consent. Asel, please chip in if you think it isn't. But it's all. But the devil is in the detail. It's in what you are garnering the consent for, and how you are then being explicit on the use of that data that you are now gathering consent. I would urge, if that's something that you're doing in terms of building a secure online consent form, I would urge you to either take advice on what consent you are explicitly trying to receive, to ensure that the form is being very unambiguous, and also very specific and explicit in the way that it's asking for, or the consent it's asking for. But the format I don't see as being an issue.